A brief word and reminder about today's question and answer. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you. I'll be on the main floor. Tim Moore will be up on the upper floor. Please, if I may say, no speeches. Just ask the question, because that gives more people a chance to ask a question. We know you are glad to be here and that you've learned a lot about the lecture, but just ask the question if you would. And I think John will be available for any follow-up questions you may have throughout today. It is now my privilege to call on Dr. Ken McFadden, our Vice President and Academic Dean, and a Union alum who will host this morning's lecture and our question and answers. Ken.
Good morning. I first had a chance to hear John Thatamanil at an AAR annual meeting a number of years ago. He was serving on a panel, and I was totally impressed. I went up afterwards, I handed him a business card and said, I will be in touch with you soon to invite you to Union Presbyterian Seminary for an event. And indeed, in February of 2015, he was our Dahl lecturer. So it's wonderful to have you back again this year for more time, for more input, and for opportunities to engage you in relation to your topic this year. I also want to welcome all of you for investing 3 days of your time and energy and your intellect into this rigorous series. If there's no learner, there's no teacher. If there's no teacher, there's no learner. So there's a wonderful interplay between teaching and learning that is only possible when we gather and we co-labor together to see what we may leave with. So welcome to all. It's wonderful to share this time together today, and we will stand and sing as we are able. Hymn 408, There's a Sweet, Sweet Spirit. Please be seated. Our prayer this morning begins with a verbal word cloud. As you hear these words, reflect upon their connections to your experiences, to your experience of the divine, of your prayers to the divine. Let us pray. Realities. Mind. Heart. Heart-mind. Truth. Desire. Trust. Imago Dei. Hope. Refuge. You are truth, O God, our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble and in troubling times. Overcome our fear and anxiety amid uncertainty with desire that certainly emanates from you. Be our confidence as the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, and its waters roar and foam. As creation bears witness to you, lead us along the river to the city of God. Stir within us a delight in our journey until we find an eternal home in you. Amen.
It has been such a joy to be with you over these last few days. A sense of real warmth and community and the capacity and curiosity to think together with you has been just an immense gift. So I'm glad to have come back a second time. A special thanks to Pastor Liz for this wonderful kefaya. It will be close to my heart in these difficult times. Yes, it's from Bethlehem. So, the give and take that is implicit even when there isn't Q&A has also been incredibly rich. I can feel your energies and your queries and questions, but I am here all day today. I'm not missing a thing. So please do ask me the questions we don't get around to. So, and of course, I also have to give Veronica a special note of thanks because, she's almost lifted me into a homiletic register. But I was... I wasn't expecting call and response to happen during the Sprunt lectures, but So anyway, you can tell I'm having a great time. Last night, as Evelyn Terry was driving me back to the Hilton, I was scrolling aimlessly on Facebook, and I started to read an article about Gisele Bündchen and Tom Brady. Just then I thought to myself, who cares? I don't want to be reading this. Evelyn, I don't know where you are. I might have even said that out loud. After all, I was sitting in the car having a thoughtful conversation with wonderful Evelyn, who was being so encouraging about my lectures, and I was tempted to read about people I have no interest or connection to. Dear listener, I'm proud to say that I did not read that inane story from CBS Sports and opted instead to enjoy Evelyn's presence. I suspect you know why I'm sharing this micro moment with you. It captures all too well that our desires are often not our own. It seems radically counterintuitive to make that claim because, after all, what could be more properly mine than my desires? Right? We might say, paraphrasing Augustine, that our desires are nearer to us than we are to ourselves. But that is all too often simply not true. We are constantly being buffeted about by currents of desire produced in us by others. These desires cycle in and through us, often through the instrumentalities of social media. Most often, these currents of desire flow beneath the lens of conscious awareness. It was a small miracle that at that moment, when I became consciously aware of what I was doing, I'm going to let someone else's attempt to make me care about Giselle and Tom eat into my time with Evelyn. In these past 3 lectures, I have argued that we take to be true what we want to believe is true. Our convictions about what we take to be true, therefore, is a byproduct of our desires. But what follows if our desires are not in our control, despite appearances to the contrary? Well, that's a deep insight that we're going to have to think about, because we are so steeped in discourses of autonomy and each of us being sovereign over our own desires, when that just isn't true. So what if there are, and I clearly believe there are, a whole host of cultural forces at play that are invested in shaping my desires, and through my desires also my beliefs, and hence my worldview? Do I really want to permit people to make me deeply invested in the doings of the Kardashians? What follows from this line of reflection? If we do not invest ourselves in the reclamation of our attention, then our desiring is left to the mercy of others. If our desiring is in the grip of other persons and cultural forces, then we are not in a position to do the arduous work of moving toward the truth. At the heart of the work of therapy for the post-truth predicament, therefore, must be a therapy of desire. Last night I argued that the prognosis for the post-truth predicament is positive, because there is something in the human heart that is innately oriented toward the truth. The post-truth predicament may be grave, but I contend that our prognosis is good. But however positive any prognosis is, for a serious ailment, we always require the full engagement and participation of the patient. Medical interventions are never miracle cures. Here we already perceive the special challenges that must be faced. And I don't have clear answers. We need to think about this together. The special challenges to be faced when the patient in question is an entire culture, or even more extensively speaking, a set of intersecting and nested global systems that wound and traumatize persons and communities, and even the living planet itself. Post-truth is not just pre-fascism. Post-truth also serves as the ground for the climate crisis and species extinction. So, if distorted desire is the root problem, and not a lack of access to the facts narrowly construed, we really must think about what a therapy of desire, to use Nussbaum's phrase, what does that look like when we're speaking not just interpersonally, but publicly? Hence the title of this lecture, which it's a grand title. Its promise is not going to be fulfilled. A therapy of public desire. a therapy of public desire, right? Sometimes the gift might be just that we have to figure that out, right? Just naming that as a task for us probably is the best thing I'm going to do today. So, after all, it's not just a question of my private desires gone awry and how I use or don't use my cell phone, but how a whole set of structural forces impinge upon our desiring. That's the challenging question. So, I now want to maintain a twofold stance. First, the distorted desires which hold us in their grip are powerful and they are structural. Religious traditions, particularly in their contemporary expressions, are well aware that the human predicament implicates not just persons, but larger social wholes. We are inextricably entangled with each other, but not just through face-to-face encounters, but by a host of institutional structures, histories, media sources, cultural frames, and the like. Post-truth finds expression in all these social, cultural, and political institutions. Since post-truth is a public and collective predicament, it must be treated as such. Second, I maintained yesterday and now reiterate that however powerful these distorted desires might seem, they can be defeated. And that's because I argued that they don't have a foothold in the real. Right? They're not what our heart desires. On Christian grounds, if we affirm Augustine's famous proposition, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee, then we can affirm that there's something in the soul that's directed toward the divine. Calvin, too, affirms that the knowledge of the divine is innate in human beings. You got to drop some Calvin if you're in a Presbyterian. If that knowledge, he even makes an argument I thought I made as a kind of original one, and it's not really. He argues that even our propensity to idolatry testifies to our own innate orientation toward God. In other words, the heart knows the true even when it's in the grip of the false, not least because the false routinely fails to satisfy. When our desires are in the grip of other enchantments or misenchantments, they are never enough. They leave us wanting. They consume us as though from within and lead to world loss. Our relationship to the world remains in the key of consumption. We seek to devour or dominate rather than to know or to love. And arguments of similar structure can be made on Buddhist and Hindu grounds. They too argue that the desires that hold us in their grip are, at some fundamental level, illusory and unreal, and powerful, but also not rooted in the real. So, we can do the work of therapy. It is possible to do the work of therapy. To begin with, once we've recognized that desire gone wrong is desire distorted, and that desire distorted is the root cause of the post-truth predicament, here's some things we can conclude. We can conclude that we can no longer be enamored by those who suggest that the solution rests in the work of information dispensation or social policy alone. That's naive. They're not irrelevant, they're essential, but they're not going to do the trick. We must recognize that global cultures are awash in projects of affect engineering. Affect engineering is what I call it. A variety of institutions, media sources, the advertising industry, and think tanks are busy molding public affect. We are constantly being educated, or rather miseducated, on what we ought to desire. And even the word ought, of course, is not on target. Our desires are being shaped quite apart from any deliberative reflection about their ethical worth. The situation is far worse. There are many who have an almost intuitive understanding that the three poisons I have named, greed, hatred, and delusion, are powerful impulses that can be mobilized for political and consumerist effects. If you can inculcate fear, perhaps the most powerful form of aversion, if you can create in-group solidarities and mobilize out-group suspicion, if you can generate delusion and confusion by muddying the information pool, you can exercise effective control over many. Racist desires, fear of the immigrant other, fear of the Muslim other, and a whole host of corrosive desires have been skillfully mobilized within this and other nation states, in India too. Most recently, I saw signs in a public counter-protest, a counter-protest mobilized against refugee children, in which the counter-protesters chanted, "Not my children, not my problem." Right? The shameless display of such toxic sentiments signals the successful cultural production and transmission of corrosive desires. There are people working to do this, and they've been working for decades to corrode public sentiment. It started with talk radio in the 80s and the dispensation of hate on the regular, right? That's been happening. And we have been soaking these affects into our psychic frame. And the consequences we're still living through. And here's another essential claim about how we're not going to solve this problem, okay? Lots of knots here. Making the problem worse, the narrow cognitivism of much academic life leaves persons and societies ill-equipped to interrogate desire, or even to imagine that our desires are worthy of attention, investigation, care, and molding. Right? Captive to a narrow paradigm which first splits the mind from the heart, and then, second, defaults into an uninterrogated conviction that only minds can be educated. Desire is left to the mercy of the affect engineers, amateur and professional, who either intuitively or through careful research know that where desire leads, thought will soon follow. If we believe what we want to believe, and the capacity to shape what we want has been surrendered to others, we are in no position to resist post-truth. Put simply, reigning conceptions of the educational enterprise leave little room for the labor of tutoring desire. Now, thankfully, in recent years, new kinds of discourse are emerging. There is now some talk about emotional intelligence and even some writing on critical feeling, not just critical thinking. These stirrings mark the fragile beginning of a recognition that university discourses have too long remained stubbornly committed to the work of critical reason alone, and that, too, a rather shriveled and anemic conception of reason. Insofar as seminary education mimics and is captured by the prestige of reigning conceptions of university education, we too will remain bound to conceptions of the educational task that is rooted in very narrow accounts of the human being, which is to say that we will operate with an impoverished theological anthropology. We can't fall prey to that, not the seminaries. So, how do we resist? My lectures have been offering and dropping clues throughout, but here are a few key conclusions. I'm going to skip because I want to get to the questions. What distinguishes religious traditions and the wisdom they have to offer is that our traditions do not fall prey to the notion that our core teachings can be conveyed as matters of propositions. Now, Protestants have fallen more prey to this propositionalism than Catholics, but we know better, right? Teaching is never reducible to transmitting a set of propositions. So, new ways of looking at the world and new truth can only be transmitted when we take on embodied practices that install, transform ways of seeing the world into our bodies. Speaking from a variety of religious traditions, the goal of religious life is, I really love this word, comportment. Comportment. That is, the comportment of persons and communities to the way things really are. Comportment is never merely a work of accepting propositions. On the contrary, the work in question is the labor of becoming true. The labor of becoming true. We might speak of truing ourselves to reality. We might speak of giving ourselves over to the real. We might speak of a practice of the fidelity to the real. The goal is not to say true things, to utter true proposition, but to conform ourselves to the way things really are. That's what the therapy of desire does in religious traditions, right? It takes hold of our desires as they exist and seeks to shape them in directions that are life-giving and healing. Hence, religious traditions insist that adherents must take on practices of right thought, right speech, and right action, which are animated and motivated by right desire. In the words of Christian hymnody, there is no possibility of becoming true apart from the labor of tuning the heart to sing God's praise. Right? Tuning the heart. That's the work ahead of us. Put more formally, religious traditions offer interpretive schemes, ways of looking at the world, and therapeutic regimes. Right? Interpretive schemes tell us what the shape of the world is like, and therapeutic regimes seek to conform us to those interpretive schemes. Recall Foucault's language that we need to wed philosophy with spirituality. And he defines spirituality this way. We will call spirituality then the set of these researches, practices, and experiences, which may be purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, which are not for knowledge, but for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to the truth. So we need those therapeutic regimes, and we need to be thinking about how they might be put to public use. To summarize the shape and texture of what these practices seek to do, I think across traditions we can say this. They seek to move egocentric desire in the shape of craving, hatred, or aversion and delusion outward. At least one Christian way of saying this is to speak about incurvatus in se, right? That we are curved in upon ourselves. We can identify distorted desires. We have the wisdom to identify these desires, right? What do they look like, the distorted ones? They seek to appropriate, consume, dominate, or bend reality to our will. If distorted desire has this characteristic inward turning shape, then the orientation or disposition we assume, that we seek to assume, will have to have the shape of an undefended and loving open-heartedness to the real. Right? An undefended and loving open-heartedness to the real. The counter desires we must cultivate are ones that teach us to open our hearts to the way things really are. The traditions don't agree about how to characterize these desires because their worldviews are distinctive, but there is a resonance in their vocabularies because these religious traditions will speak of sympathy, empathy, compassion, and love. Right? Those are the characteristic vocabularies across traditions about what it looks like when curved in upon oneself desires become transformed into outward world-loving forms of desire. None of this is about extinguishing desire. It's about redirecting it. None of this is about a kind of escapism to another worldly reality, but being rightly attuned to the real as it is. All of these things we can say. Now, I was thinking I was going to lead you in actual practice for 10 minutes, but I don't know that I have the time. Do it anyway? Let's just do a little bit of practice to see what this feels like in the body. And then, with the body's wisdom, I wonder if you can help us think together about what it would look, how we might generate such affects in the public rather than in one body at a time. Do you see what I mean? Like, we don't have a one body at a time. We don't have the time for that. We've got to figure out, we have to do that work for ourselves, but we have to think publicly too. But I don't know if we can do that if we don't have a sense of what this feels like in the body. So, as part of this practice, I'm going to ask you to call to mind a benefactor. Here's what I mean. Think of someone who, when you just imagine them or see their face, you just feel profoundly cherished. Like the very thought of them makes you breathe more deeply and feel adored, cherished, loved. Right? It might even be a pet. It might not need to be a person, right? So call that to mind. It could be a spiritual figure. So when I say the word benefactor in the practice, that's what you need to call up. For this practice, it's best to keep the eyes open and lowered rather than closed. Just quickly scan the body and see if there are any places in the body where you are clenching or tightening or experiencing stress, and invite the body to become at ease. Maybe you tend to clench your jaws or crinkle your forehead. Just check in with those places. Then turn to the breath and invite the breath to become long and regular, all the way into the belly. And then soften the belly. In our workaholic cultures, too often the belly is almost always clenched in some way. Now turning to mind, see if you can let the thought stream slow down. And as that happens, notice the space in between thoughts. Permit yourself to rest in the space of the thoughts. Notice that it seems inherently restful, spacious. And as thoughts arise, just let them float by like passing clouds in the blue sky of the mind. Now just let the mind fall open, spacious. You can know if this is successful because you almost immediately begin to hear ambient noises more clearly. Now to the heart of the practice. Call to mind this cherished person in whose presence you know yourself to be deeply loved. You might imagine this person now before you. Imagine their care and cherishing of you as a warm beam of light that's coming right from their hearts, right into your heart. And your only task for the next couple of moments is to receive this warmth of care and love, the way you might see a puppy lying on a carpet in a beam of light and just soaking it in. Now, imagine this person, and if more than one person came to mind, that's fine, behind you, and this beam of light of loving care going through you from behind into your heart. Now imagine that your own heart's love and loving energy itself as a beam of light that's radiating out from in front of you. Now call to mind a person or persons that you find easy to love. Now imagine that radiating light that comes from the people who are dear to you and your own heart's loving energy directed at this person whom you find easy to love. Just wish them well. May they be happy. May they be full of joy. May they be at peace. Now, because time is short, imagine a neutral person before you. Maybe the person you see at the grocery store every time you go shopping. And extend this same radiant, loving care from within your heart now to this person as well. May they too be well, happy, full of joy. Now, the last step in this practice for today. Call to mind a challenging person, someone who might cause you difficulties. Not the hardest person you have to deal with, but just a challenging one. Now extend the same energy of loving care to this challenging person. May they too be happy, deeply well, full of joy. Now let the visualization dissolve. And just a couple of moments of just open mind, open heartedness. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be at peace. And when you're ready, come back to our common space. Now, time is very short, so I'm just going to make a few quick points. Did you see how that worked? Did you notice the changes in your body? The traditions that we cherish believe that that practice is restoring us to the natural amplitude of the heart. That this kind of infinite, open-ended love is really something we are capable of. Now, how might we do the work of making this cultural? I have just a few suggestions. First, we have no way of rectifying public desire without surrendering the thinking-feeling binary. We must teach ourselves and others that this thinking-feeling binary is obsolete, inaccurate, untrue. You can't work a deficient anthropology and try to rectify culture. It's not going to work. The best book I know on this is Donovan Schaefer's wonderful book, Wild Experiment: Feeling, Science, and Secularism After Darwin. He shows us that scientists are hardly neutral. They're driven by passion for their quest. So the idea of objective science is a caricature. It's not true. He shows us that no neuroscientist believes that there are parts of the brain that only do thinking and other parts that only do feeling. That is not part of brain science anymore. It's a fiction. Thinking is driven by passion, and the solution to when thinking goes wrong is not to be dispassionate, but to mobilize other feelings against feelings of excitement for particular ideas that get over the top, right? So always the work is feeling with feeling, not opposing something called feeling with sober-minded reason. Develop thicker accounts of what truth is. That's my second important solution. Don't be captive to ways of thinking that suggest that thinking is just about propositions. Truth is about propositions. Truth is not just about what we say, right? I mean, we come from traditions that say God is truth, right? So we need ways of thinking about truth that make truth synonymous with the real, and that our work is to come into loving accord with the real. Third suggestion, we need to go back to the nonviolence traditions. Right? The nonviolent traditions are the only collective set of exercises that sought to transform public affect to scale. Right? The goal of mobilizing entire nation states to feel differently, not just to think differently, but even that's not quite right? It's to think differently by feeling differently, because they're utterly inseparable, right? So these were attempts to mobilize love as public sentiment. And they worked. Gandhi and King made enormous differences in public affect at scale. Right? So I think we need to return to those traditions and investigate them with care to get real clues about how we can transform addiction and craving and hatred and suspicion. Right? Because if those sentiments are the ones that corrode us, we need to mobilize opposite sentiments, right? Equal and opposite sentiments, maybe actually more powerful sentiments, because I think love is in fact stronger. So, let me use a prosaic example. Just as the use of fluoride in the water helps to prevent tooth decay, the strategic and persistent use of love can prevent truth decay. Right? The strategic and persistent use of love can prevent truth decay. So we have to ask collectively, and I hope we have a few minutes to think about this, how we can use the energies of loving nonviolence as a kind of culturally pervasive energy that might arrest truth decay and transform our communities from bondage to the lie to a loving intimacy with the real. That's the task before us. I think it can be done. Let's think together. Keep applauding and we're going to run out of time for questions.
I'm going to count that as our word of thanks, because there's no better word. We do have an opportunity for some questions. Not a lot, but this is the beginning of an opportunity that extends through the day. So let's come right here.
So, given that it can be such a personal thing, desire, how do you handle the despair of feeling like you can't affect the general populace?
Well, I think the first question I want people to think about is, what if that's a powerful sentiment itself, that serves the interests of those invested in the status quo? What if the despair itself is culturally produced, right? That, oh, you can't do anything, right? If you're persuaded of that, you will in fact do nothing, and the people who materially gain are the people who like things the way they are. So part of what I'm suggesting is that many of our desires that feel intimately personal might be publicly produced. And among the ways that people resist that particular feeling is by being together. Right? Every one of us who is alone is probably accurately feeling that I can't do much by myself. But we don't have to do anything by ourselves. A friend of mine calls the desire to save the world that particularly young people often feel, he calls that vocational titanism. I must save the world, right? And you're done, right? Because you're going to fight your first battle and you realize I can't do much by myself. It's in solidarity that despair is overcome. It's in collective action that despair is overcome. So practices of the body include practice of nonviolent resistance in collective action.
Looks like we have one right over here, third row.
All through this, I've been thinking of you too. All I got is a red guitar, 3 chords, and the truth.
I love it.
So I'm hoping that you can comment on the role of music in truing or misaligning our desires.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's profound. I just want to say amen to that. You can only ask that question once you realize that the key of change has to happen in the key of desire. Right? Because if you think in a narrowly cognitive way, what does music have to do with anything? Right? But all those, recently, the union, many of the union faculty and students walked around the Columbia campus as an act of cleansing and filling that space with another imagination than the one that the police inflicted upon it. And we sang the old freedom songs. And we sang as we walked, and the body feels different when it sings. Yes. And a courage enters into solidarity. When we sing, we shall not be moved. Yes. that was vital, right? That's how we tutor ourselves into other affects, into other solidarities. Music matters.
I think maybe last question.
Thank you. Can you expand on using language that we might be familiar in the Reformed tradition of sin and sanctification? Because I got a sense that maybe all falsehood is external, which I don't think you're saying that, the purgation and all that. Is there anything to articulate with sin and sanctification that layers onto what you've been sharing with us?
I mean, this entire lectures have been about sin and sanctification. Oh, I thought my microphone with the... It is working, so I'll speak louder. Yes, now, there is some truth to what you're saying, right? Insofar as I believe that we are made in the image of God, I do believe that when distorted desires enter into self and society, they're probably publicly shaped. Right? Now, is there a sense in which there's an individual component? Yeah, I think there is, right? There is a sense in which once you think of yourself as, this is what the Buddhists and Hindus are always saying, as non-relational, as an isolated self that needs to be in some way protected or augmented by what it owns or takes in, then you're in a hard way, right? Because it's easy then, when you see yourself as a small, puny person, to be conditioned into believing that you and your entire life project must be about augmenting yourself, most especially through buying, consuming, right? Or selling. You got to have a side hustle. You have to think of yourself as a consumer and a producer, right? Your monetary value is your value. So I'm just very aware that the textures of sin are socially constructed. What sin looks like is not identical across a variety of cultural contexts. And I think capitalism and racism, white supremacism, these are the primary distorting desires that colonize the heart. I have a deeply positive theological anthropology. I think we're corrupted from without and can be redeemed by grace from without too. So yeah, we need to talk about this more. Maybe I don't have this just right, so you'll have to correct me.
For our response, let us stand and sing hymn number 376, When All Is Ended. And the people said, Amen. Let us proceed on to the reception where we will greet colleagues and return here for worship at 11 o'clock. That was marvelous. It was marvelous.
Despite being rushed?
No, it was great. It was great because, part of